hello everybody. I'm Sister Mary Alice, and I'm here in the foyer of the IHM Center. And it's been my desire to be able to share a little bit more about the IHM congregation with all of you who are staff at St. Joseph Center. So today Megan Stevens is with me. She's on the other side of the camera. We are in a home where many people live, the IHM sisters, and so there will be some distractions, to say the least. So hopefully when you hear some of the background noise, you'll get a sense that this is just a regular home. This is the IHM Center Immaculate Heart of Mary, or what the letters stand for, and it's the main meeting place of the IHM sisters. We have our meetings here when we meet as a congregation. We also have celebrations here. We host meetings. Many staff from St. Joseph Center have been here to attend meetings over the many years. So that's a brief background, but I wanted to share this story because the story of the congregation is very much interconnected with the history and the foundation of St. Joseph's. Not St. Joseph Center, but St. Joseph's, and I'll explain a little bit more about that when we get started. But I'm delighted to be able to share this with all of you. So a little bit like a museum, we have some display boards here, at permanent display boards here at the IHM Center, and I'm going to use those as the backdrop to explain the history of the congregation and our presence here in northeastern Pennsylvania. Behind me right now is a picture of the mural that is in the rotunda at Marywood University. It's a very beautiful rotunda. If you ever have the opportunity to visit that, you should do that. But what's significant about this, the Marywood University also is a sponsored ministry like St. Joseph Center of the Congregation of the Sister Servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. And one of the murals in this beautiful rotunda is dedicated to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, and some important figures in the life of the congregation are depicted here as well, and I'm going to explain them a little bit later. St. Alphonsus Liguori, Mother Teresa Maxis Duchemin, Reverend Louis Florent Gillet, and I'll tell you a little bit about them as we go through this presentation. So we'll conclude there. Okay, the first boards that I'm going to share with you have to do with written documents related to the congregation. And I should mention, people ask this sometimes. So the proper name is the Congregation of the Sister Servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. And it is okay to say Sisters of IHM or IHM Sisters. We use it kind of interchangeably. But just so you know, IHM stands for Immaculate Heart of Mary. So we have documents similar to a nonprofit organization, things such as bylaws, but we call it constitution. So it's a written document that all sisters abide by. It's kind of a guidebook, if you will. So our constitutions are very historic, related to the development of the congregation. And each of them, no matter how lengthy it is, it seems as if one thing speaks to you personally. And for us, for many of us as Sisters of IHM, from our many pages of the Constitution, what delights us the most is this expression that says, we strive to serve in a joyful, loving, hospitable, and self-emptying way. So no matter where you are, no matter what ministry you're invited to serve, to be there present in your particular work, but with this spirit. And that's what the Constitution calls us each to. In addition to our IHM constitutions, we have a few other written documents that do their best to summarize the life of the congregation and all of our sisters collectively. And one is the charism statement. So charism, similar to the word charisma, is a gift of the Holy Spirit. Just like each of us has a unique gift given to us, which becomes our personality, the charism statement is unique to the Congregation of the Sister Servants of the Immaculate Heart in Scranton. And of all that it has to say, what I especially appreciate is this notion that we're all, as IHM sisters, called to proclaim the good news of God's unconditional love for all. So it's not just for those most deserving, it's really this notion that God's love pours out upon each of us. God initiates the relationship with us. It's not as if we have to work hard or be a certain way to deserve God's love. So that's a great message that's part of this charism statement. In addition, the recognition that Mary, the first disciple, the first to respond unconditionally to God's call, is recognized as a model of faith and fidelity that we're called to imitate. Just like St. Joseph Center has a mission statement and core values, so does the congregation. So this explains a little bit about the history of the congregation, that we're housed here in Scranton, Pennsylvania, although our ministries do take us to many different states and dioceses and even some other countries. A little bit about our foundation, our founding story. But what I love about this whole statement is that all our ministries, so wherever a sister is called in response to God's unconditional love to serve, and to serve in that manner that we spoke about, all our ministries are works for justice and peace. So irregardless of the location or the role that you play, as IHM sisters, we're called to promote with our co-workers, with those we assist, to promote peace and justice. And finally, to talk about our written documents would be to include our core values. So as a congregation, we have named 5, and these 5 are rootedness in God, community justice, respect for diversity, and wholeness. So rootedness in God would seem kind of obvious. It's that idea that our spirituality is really at the core of our relationship with one another. Community is that sense not only of our community as a congregation, but also to build community wherever we're called to minister. And justice is a special core value that I think unites us closely to the work of St. Joe's, which is standing with, defending, empowering those who are denied full human dignity. So when you think of the history of St. Joe's, first service to women who were maybe marginalized by society and creating safe homes for them to give birth to their child, as well as supporting people with intellectual disabilities who at one point in the history of our country really would have been isolated. So when we talk about standing with, empowering, advocating for, promoting the dignity, certainly we can see at St. Joe's how that IHM core value is brought to life, as well as the respect for diversity of all people throughout all of creation. And finally, wholeness is that invitation to seek balance. You know, we talk about it at work as well. What's the work-life balance? You know, how do I make sure I have the right energy for the many things that I'm called to be, as well as develop in the many different aspects of the human person. So psychologically, emotionally, intellectually, physically, spiritually, we're complex people. And so how do I make a commitment to grow and develop in each aspect of my life? I'm standing in the foyer of our chapel within the IHM Center. We have a beautiful chapel. It's where sisters celebrate their profession of vows, jubilees. On occasion, we have funeral services here for our IHM sisters. It's also where we host an evening of prayer once a month that you and all our colleagues at our sponsored ministries are invited to attend. You can always check with myself or Sister Lenore or any of the sisters regarding those dates. We do try and make them available as well. One of the greatest features inside this IHM Center also would be this beautiful statue of Teresa Maxis Duchemin. So I want to draw your attention to it. This was created by Sister Cor Immaculata Heffron. Sister was a longtime faculty member at Marywood University. She entitled this statue Teresa at Home. So I mentioned already that Mother Teresa Maxis Duchemin was the co-founder of the IHM congregation. She called this statue Teresa at Home, although Teresa never lived in Scranton specifically. She was part of this region. She did live here for a time. What she depicted was Teresa in motion. You know, a lot of times when we see statues, they look very still. But she wanted to show Teresa as a person in motion, and she did an excellent job of doing that. You could see as her fabric is moving, but she shows Teresa also with an open hand, indicating that she did invite others to join her in the great endeavor known as the IHM congregation, as well as holding a book. Of course, we might think this might be the Holy Scripture, but it also shows Teresa Maxis' dedication to education as a way of really empowering and releasing people's great potential. So it's a beautiful statue. Teresa's head is cast upward, showing that she always had her eyes fixed on God and God's invitation of service to many people. And it also shows, I think to some degree, it really depicts her courage. So you see, she has a very strongly fixed jaw, an indication of the courage that Teresa had to have in her life to face some very difficult situations. To share the history of the congregation, we really have to take a step back and look at upon what spirituality is the IHM congregation based. And to do that, we have to take a look at the life of St. Alphonsus Liguori. St. Alphonsus lived in the 1700s. He lived in Italy. He was born to a very wealthy family, which in those days meant he had the access to great education, cultural events, and he was a well-educated man. He was a great scholar. He was educated as a lawyer, canon and civil law. He was a poet, an artist, a musician, many great talents. Well, Alphonsus had this bright career, but in his late 20s, he lost a law case. And so he kind of had a crisis of identity to say, well, maybe this isn't what I am intended. Maybe this isn't my profession. So I'm going to take a different look at life. He had for a long time also been a volunteer with the Hospital of the Incurables. And as a volunteer, he really had a sense of God's profound love for those who were in need. And so Alphonsus created an order. He became a priest. He created an order that he called the Order of the Holy Redeemer. Today it's known as the Redemptorist Order, and there are Redemptorist priests who serve as missionaries throughout the world. One of Alphonsus's teachings specifically is this idea of God's love for the abandoned poor, that God's love is unconditional. We don't deserve it. It's given first to us, and then we respond to God's love. So a very great concept, and a concept that is very foundational to the life of the congregation. In his life, Alphonsus, as a young man, as a person in his family and church, he was very much influenced by the Immaculate Heart of Mary, by St. Joseph, because Joseph was committed to what we call divine providence, that with God all will be well. And also the life of St. Teresa of Avila and her writings. And St. Teresa, although she lived in the 1600s, she lived in Spain, she had a bit of a background similar to Alphonsus in that she had access to education. But Teresa was one who had this sense of your prayer life should be very contemplative, but your ministry, you shouldn't just hold it to yourself. You need to extend that understanding of God to all people. So that's important to the life of the congregation, and that was influential in the history of our foundation, specifically in the people who we claim as our co-founders. So now I'm going to draw your attention to those two people. This is an image of Father Louis Florent Gillet. He was a Redemptorist priest. He was French-speaking. He was from Belgium. He was sent to the United States, to the area around Monroe, Michigan, the border of Canada. So his being French-speaking was very useful. We have to remember in the 1800s, the United States was considered missionary territory where the church was not yet developed. As new cities and towns and states within the United States were being developed, the church was developing as well. So Louis Florent Gillet came here. He was starting a church in a parish, and he recalled from his European background that the sisters made great teachers. So he wanted to attract or create a congregation of sisters who would teach the young people in his church. And so he was looking for a sister who might be willing to come. He found out, and she heard his invitation, and Mother Teresa Maxis Duchemin, she was already a member of a religious order. She was a member of the Oblate Sisters of Providence in Baltimore, Maryland. But she was French-speaking, and in Baltimore at this time, she was not able to use her French language. So she thought this would be a great opportunity for her to get a fresh start. Teresa went to Monroe, Michigan, and with two other women, on November 10th, 1845, they started the Congregation of the Sister Servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. This is an image of their small convent that's a log cabin where they made their first vows and began to teach in the school and create new opportunities for the children in that area. So when I mentioned Mother Teresa Maxis, I mentioned that she was a member of a religious congregation. She was looking for a new opportunity. Teresa was one of the first members of the Oblate Sisters of Providence. It was an order that began in 1829 in Baltimore, Maryland. Teresa was born in 1810, so she was 19 years old. She accepted the invitation of Mother Mary Lang to found a congregation. This would be a congregation that was the first American congregation for for women who are African American or of African descent. This is very significant because Teresa's history, if I were to give her background, Teresa was born to a Haitian woman. Her father was a visiting military officer from Britain who was visiting his family in Baltimore, Maryland. So from the relationship, Betsy Duchemin and her father gave birth to Teresa Maxis Duchemin, although he was never part of her life. The Howard family, for whom Betsy worked, was very committed to Teresa's education and took great care of her. So she was an educated woman of color in the 1810s, early 1800s in Baltimore. So she was right there pre-Civil War, right there in a very hot spot, if you will. It also was a time of anti-Catholicism in Baltimore because people were not in favor of Catholics and certainly women of color educating their children. So Teresa began to have great concern about the future of the Oblate Sisters. They are an order that continues today, so that's not a concern. Although, like many religious congregations, they have fewer members, but they're very committed to the needs of Catholics and those who are African American in Baltimore. This is the simple beginnings that they have, and this kind of explains some of the suffering that they experienced in pre-Civil War Baltimore. So as I mentioned there with Teresa Maxis, when she went to Monroe, Michigan, she presented herself as white. And when we reflect upon this now as a congregation with this much history to look back on, we realize what a cruel way racism influenced Teresa. And so we have, as a congregation now, really made it a commitment to take a look at undoing the harms of racism, how it impacts us as a congregation, how it impacts our church, our world, and us individually. So we have made a real commitment to understanding that better. But if we go back to 1840s, life was going along very well in Monroe, Michigan, when Father Louis Florent gets called back to Europe. That's part of the responsibility as a missionary. That could happen sometimes. He's upset by this because things were progressing very well. Mother Teresa, who's now going to continue there, gets very concerned. She was very attracted to the spirituality of St. Alphonsus, and she's concerned that if the Redemptorist priest leaves, her congregation could be taken over by the diocese or other influences. So she begins to think a little bit about maybe not staying in Monroe, Michigan, and I'll explain a little bit about that as we step down here a little bit. The reason Teresa's mother, Betsy Duchemin, was in Baltimore as a Haitian woman was a result of upheaval in Haiti that drove many families into the United States and out of Haiti, and her mother was one of those. So it's explained a little bit here, and the commitment the Howard family made to taking care of Betsy as well as her daughter Teresa. At this point, Teresa's thinking, I have to go where there is a Redemptorist priest so that the congregation, the IHM congregation, could be under the influence of a Redemptorist priest. Ironically, at that time, all of the eastern part of Pennsylvania was part of the Diocese of Philadelphia. And if you know any local church history, the Archbishop of that time, the Cardinal, was John Newman. Subsequently to be known as St. John Newman, is a Redemptorist priest. So Teresa gets this hope. Can I get somewhere where there is a Redemptorist priest? And lo and behold, there's an invitation to come to St. Joseph's, Pennsylvania. Not St. Joseph's Center, but actually the town of St. Joseph's, which is located in Susquehanna County. Teresa accepts that invitation, comes there to minister in a very humble town and to begin a school. And at the same time, she has quite a bit of confidence that because she's with a Redemptorist priest, the congregation will continue to thrive and will grow, as she hopes, in the spirituality of St. Alphonsus, that notion of God's unconditional love for all being really paramount in the life of the congregation and in each sister. But this troubles the Bishop of Detroit, who was responsible for her congregation when she was in Monroe, Michigan. Bishop Lefebvre begins to be concerned. First, Jolay leaves, now Teresa Maxis leaves. What's going to happen to my parish, to my school, to the sisters who remained here after Teresa left? So at this point, we do see some letters that are written from Bishop Lefebvre to other priests saying, be careful about her. She's a woman of color, she's not to be trusted. So again, in this reflection from our present time backwards, we can see where some anti-feminine thoughts and some racial thoughts influence Teresa. I mentioned earlier that Teresa was a courageous woman. She felt she met adversity head-on in order to pursue her mission and her love for God and to serve God's people. And this is an example of the kind of challenge that she was faced with. At this time, the bishops decide that there's going to be a division in the congregation. One chapter would remain, or branch as we call it, in Monroe, Michigan, and then there would be a Pennsylvania foundation. The Pennsylvania branch is subsequently divided when the Diocese of Philadelphia breaks into numerous dioceses, and so that's when we have the branch in Philadelphia, which is known as the Immaculata IHMs, and the Scranton branch, which is founded here in Scranton on the campus of Marywood University. So we have three branches of the IHM congregation: Monroe, Michigan, Immaculata, Pennsylvania, and Scranton, Pennsylvania. This troubles Teresa because her hope for that value of community was that her sisters could all be one. Now, because of the bishops, they have made this division. So Teresa gets another good idea. She's an impulsive woman, if you've learned that about her as well. She thinks, I'll leave the situation. The bishops are angry at me. They have nothing against these three branches. Maybe if I leave the situation, they could be united. And so Teresa takes herself to Ottawa, Canada, where she will be a Grey Nun. She spent 17 years there waiting to be reunited with the congregation. Then as an older woman, she's permitted by the Bishop of Philadelphia to come back to the Immaculata Order, where she eventually passed away in 1892. So she lived to be 82 years old. She was a member of 3 different religious congregations and served as the co-founder of one of those, the Immaculate Heart of Mary Order. So really a woman very convinced that God was directing her to do certain things, and it's upon this legacy that we could look forward into really going forward now to 1888 to think a little bit about how St. Joseph's began. So in this main hallway of the IHM Center, we also have the portraits of the women who have served in an elected leadership as the Superior General, or today we would call the woman the President of the congregation. The current President, Sister Ellen Maroney, serves as the President of what's called the St. Joseph Center Corporation, the St. Joseph's Foundation Corporation, and the St. Joseph Center Auxiliary Corporation, and that's part of our sponsorship relationship. But the first portrait is Sister Teresa Maxis Duchemin, who I've explained, but I also want to draw your attention, if I can, to Mother Mary Frances Henry. She was from that Philadelphia congregation when the division occurred. She was one of 11 sisters who came and formed the Scranton branch of the IHM congregation. And it was during her tenure that St. Joseph's Center began. It was St. Joseph's Society of Volunteers, a group of volunteers at that time. But it was in 1888, as you know, the beginning of St. Joe's. Her term ended in 1889. She was born in Ireland. And I also know about her that she lived to be to the year 1912. So it's interesting to think all that she would have seen. She would have seen the first 24 years of the life of St. Joseph's, and to know that she had an influence on that. The courage that she and others had, you know, at the time that we began, women who were pregnant and unmarried were very much marginalized from society, treated very poorly, and the congregation, the sisters, under the direction of Mother Mary Frances Henry, welcomed them, gave them a safe place to be, promoted their dignity. So it's in that tradition that we continue the work of St. Joseph's today. The first portion of this presentation really focuses on the history of the congregation and introducing you to Mother Teresa Maxis Duchemin. The next portion really talks about our life today, specifically as Scranton, the Scranton branch of the IHM congregation, and a little bit about what holds us together as sisters. So you may know, or you may not know, that every religious sister, including the IHM sisters, we make 3 vows. We make them to God in the presence of our community, so we essentially make them to one another as sisters as well. So these vows are the vows of celibate chastity, poverty, and obedience. The way we understand celibate chastity today, it is true, it's being unmarried, but it's for the intention of serving God. And so that vow invites me to recognize my love relationship, my primary relationship as that is with God. Poverty is not about economic or material poverty, because in truth, I have quite a bit. I have a place to live, I have food, I have health insurance, I have a car, I have much of the things that people who suffer economically don't have. This form of poverty is instead to really make me aware that my dependency rests with God. So my true dependency is with God for all that matters. And finally, the vow of obedience is, to be obedient to the will of God, to listen to my sisters in community, to hear God's voice through them, and to be attentive to that. This board also is a reminder that as an IHM sister, no matter what my particular ministry or role or position might be, that really my greatest contribution to the congregation and therefore to the church and world is to be a woman of prayer. And that crosses the lifespan. In a special way, we look at retired sisters and their commitment to pray for all of us in ministry, to pray for the work of St. Joseph Center, to be united with the concerns of the entire church and the entire world. So to continue describing how the congregation really grew and evolved and continued to meet needs, it's important to mention the congregation's great commitment to education. And so as the church was evolving and expanding in the United States, so was the congregation. So very often a call would come from a pastor, could you send 3 sisters to provide teachers for our school, and the congregation grew that way. But uniquely in northeastern Pennsylvania, there were some influences, and that, of course, would be on what was the business of the day, coal mining and factory work. And so the sisters adapted to meet the needs of those people. So in one case, serving the needs of the breaker boys by having schools sometimes, or lessons right where the coal mines were, or meeting with women who worked in factories during the day, teaching them in the evenings. There also were some unique things to the IHM congregation in addition to education, and we know the story of St. Joseph's Center and how the congregation felt a special call to respond to that need here in Scranton and to touch so many lives through the 131 years of St. Joseph's Center. I'll explain a little bit more about that sponsor relationship. The congregation also was involved with the history and the development of a healthcare system in Carbondale, which unfortunately has closed, and responding uniquely to the needs of this community, looking at the influenza epidemic from the early 1900s, and many of us locally would remember the Agnes flood in Wilkes-Barre in 1972. The sisters were called upon to respond at that time and did so very generously. Because northeastern Pennsylvania is influenced by the history of immigration, so is the congregation. Once we commit ourselves to a particular area, we're influenced by it, and at the same time we help to influence that. And that would be true in a very unique way. The IHM congregation in Scranton had a relationship with 3 other religious congregations. The Sisters of St. Casimir were committed to developing resources in a response to people who were from Lithuania, and also the Sisters of St. Cyril and Methodius, who were committed to responding to the needs of people who had immigrated from Slovak countries, as well as having a hand in the development of the Sisters of Jesus Crucified. So these women came early from their countries, asked to be part of the congregation in order to learn how to become a sister, in order to create their own congregations. This congregation also had several members, more than 20 members, who came from Ireland specifically. So that's when the United States was viewed as a missionary territory, and people came from Ireland to be sisters in the congregation. There also was a great chapter of our story that has to do with teaching in what was segregated South. So especially in North Carolina, where black students and white students were kept in different schools, even within the Catholic school system, the sisters would be asked to teach in one school or the other. And the sisters who taught in the black schools shared that they too were experiencing some discrimination. Not the same, but they had a sense of that because they were teaching the black students. So this was a sad chapter in the life of our country and the life of the church, and also in the life of the congregation, that sisters in the same community could experience being separated from one another in order to fulfill their ministry, their call at that time. So from this IHM Center, from our mother house here, sisters are called to serve in a lot of different places. We do gather back here every year. In the development of the congregation, sisters have served as far north as Rhode Island and Massachusetts, and as far south as Florida, and into the west a little bit in Mississippi, and then skip a few states in Idaho and Portland, Oregon, and the state of Washington and British Columbia. So it's not a clear pattern, but certainly the concentration of sisters has always been in the Mid-Atlantic region. Many times when I provide this tour in person, someone will ask about, well, when were there so many changes? You know, we see images of sisters in the traditional habit. And I think we have to go back to Vatican II. In the 1960s was really a profound transformation in the life of the church throughout the world, and of course what affects the church affects each congregation as well. And so in the 1960s, Pope John the 23rd, now St. John the 23rd, invited leaders from around the world, from the church, to come together to look at what was the new call, what were the challenges that the church was facing. He believed at the time, not unlike Alphonsus, that the church was becoming very hierarchical, too separate from the people. So he really invited women religious and all of the faithful to take a look at your foundation story, look at what is really at the crux of your vocation, and be committed to that. So at that time, sisters, a lot of them changed their ministries. Not that school ministry wasn't important to them, but they may have always felt a great call and a desire to work in parish life, to advocate for justice issues. There were lots of different invitations for sisters at that time, and so many pursued that. At the same time, our IHM Scranton congregation developed a ministry in Peru, which continues today. Our unique relationship with certain ministries is called a sponsored relationship or sponsorship. In Scranton, we have a sponsorship relationship with Marywood University. When it first began as a high school, Marywood Seminary, way back in the early 1900s, continuing as Marywood University today. Dating back to 1888, the congregation has a relationship with St. Joseph's, as I mentioned originally, St. Joseph's Society, a group of volunteers, and subsequently with all its name changes becoming St. Joseph's Center. St. Joseph's Hospital, later Marion Community Hospital in Carbondale. Friends of the Poor, the ministry founded by our member, Sister Adrienne Barrett, as well as a Montessori school and retreat center, Our Lady of Grace in Manhasset. The relationship of sponsorship is twofold. One is governance with specific legal responsibilities, and the other is stewardship. That's the nurturance of the mission. How do we ensure that all of these works are faithful to the teaching of Jesus and continue in the spirit of St. Alphonsus to remind people to witness to God's unconditional love for all people. So that's the fidelity, that's the stewardship component of sponsorship. That's why our IHM sisters are very committed and concerned about the development of all the sponsored ministries to ensure that the mission continues to meet the needs of people today and future generations. We also have a relationship with co-sponsored ministries here in Scranton. That's the Nativity Miguel School, as well as Our Lady, our Seton Academy in Baltimore, and our African Sisters Education Collaborative, which is housed here at Marywood, but really unites women religious with women religious in Africa. The final presentation board is really the call to the future. So none of us knows exactly what that will be, but we all want to be discerning, carefully considering this great tradition and past and responding to today's needs. So we'll do that with a spirit of collaboration, with fidelity to all that has been, by being women of prayer and continuing to be united with other women religious, as well as with our counterparts, our colleagues in various ministries. So that's a quick overview of the life of the congregation in the year 2020. We'll be celebrating 175th anniversary of the foundation of the IHM congregation. It's been a great history, and we all look forward to living into the future and discovering what that means for each person, and specifically for the mission of St. Joseph Center. So I hope you got a sense of the great connections that exist between the foundation of the congregation and the foundation of St. Joseph Center. Thank you.